Good evening, everyone. I'm Linda Ayers. Welcome to Tuesday Talks DC, brought to you by the Cleveland and Woodley Park Village, Cleveland Park Main Street, and the DC Public Library. You can join in the conversation tonight by posting your comments and questions using the chat function on your screen. You can do that at any time during tonight's presentation. And Frank Finnemore, Executive Director of the Village, will moderate a Q&A session at the end. Tonight's talk focuses on DC's nature and ecology, and we're lucky to have two neighborhood experts share with us how climate change and urban development have affected our local gardens and wildlife. Tamara Belt is an award-winning landscape designer and an environmentalist, and she creates sustainable gardens across the DC metro area. She founded Hawthorne Garden Design, and she's also the vice chair and chair of the landscape committee on the board of Tregaron Conservancy, one of the great natural jewels of our neighborhood. Tamara received her PhD in economics from the London School of Economics, and she worked as an environmental economist for the World Bank, excuse me, and the Inter-American Development Bank, focusing on projects in the green sector. She then completed the landscape design program at George Washington University. Erin Gleason is a hobby beekeeper who keeps an apiary of about 20 hives at the Swiss Embassy in Woodley Park, DC, with her friend Sean Kennedy. Their firm, Be Curious, LLC, catches swarms across DC, rescues hives from rooftops, and removes swarms from walls. And they are happy to share how all of us can help our little bee friends to survive and thrive. During her non-beekeeping hours, Erin works with family forest owners to create sustainable forest management with an eye toward climate and conservation goals. She holds degrees in the geosciences and climate sciences and is a master naturalist. Tamara lives in Cleveland Park. Until recently, Erin, before she decamped to the country, lived in Woodley Park, but we can still see her tending the hives at the Swiss Embassy. Welcome, Tamara and Erin. And Erin, I think you're going to kick off tonight's conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. Give me just a second to get my screen up. And thank you all for being here tonight. I am very excited to talk to you about one of my favorite topics. Many of you probably have walked by the Swiss Embassy and noted that there's quite a few hives out there in recent years. And I'd like to give you a little bit of the backstory about that, tell you a little bit about beekeeping in DC. And I'd like to point out, as my title says, that beekeeping in the capital isn't just about honeybees. So if you're not a honeybee fan because you're allergic or you're just afraid of getting stung, there's a lot of other things that you can do to support the bees without getting too close. So, and I am probably going to have a feline interruption, so I apologize for that in advance. Just kick us off before that happens. I just like to talk about my journey into beekeeping because it's something people ask about regularly, and I honestly don't have a great answer. I think my journey began though when I was working in Nepal. I was working for Mountain Institute with mountain communities on building resilience and adaptation methods into lifestyles there. And as you can see here, these logs hanging from the side of the house are beehives in the traditional Nepalese fashion. They're wonderful beehives, but the problem is that if you want a lot of honey from them, it's extremely destructive to open the hive. What you have is a hollowed out log. If you want to get in there and take out comb, you destroy everything. So all the work that the bees put into that honeycomb, you're probably going to kill quite a few bees. So that style of beekeeping is not ideal for really making a lot of profit. And in Nepal, honey can be a major source of income for mountain communities. So one of the things that I was working on when I was there was teaching farmers how to use these Langstroth hives, as they're called, which are the ones that you would see if you go to the Swiss Embassy. which you can pull the frames out of, and you can just shave off that layer of wax, centrifuge the honey. We'll talk about that a little bit further along, and put that right back in for the bees to clean up and use all of that wax, all of that honeycomb that they've already built at great cost to themselves. They can reuse that. So this is a way for both farmers and bees to benefit. I was working with communities there, and by the time I came back from this, like, I wanted this myself. And that's what led to taking a course with the DC Beekeepers Association and reaching out and making friends with somebody many of you may know who's in the neighborhood, Sean Kennedy. I think he's on the call today. He is the other main culprit in this whole story. We were keeping bees. He was keeping bees for a season before I joined him on his garage roof, which, as you can see, there's a whole lot of row houses here. Kids down here playing basketball. Occasionally somebody would get stung because bees would, get in the way of basketball, and things just didn't go very well. Caused a little bit of friction with the neighbors, who are by and large very supportive of the efforts. We still have 3 hives up on that roof. But in the end, we decided, A, we want to grow, and B, keeping bees this close to people is a little difficult. And that led us to reach out to the Swiss Embassy. Because I was walking around the neighborhood one day. I actually lived in Switzerland for 10 years. A light bulb went off. I was like, we need to call the Swiss Embassy and ask if we can keep hives. And it turns out that the current ambassador is a big fan of conservation. As many of you know, he's a phenomenal birder. So this is our humble beginning at the Swiss Embassy. We started off taking a couple of those hives off the roof and just moving them in. And that was early spring 2020. Oh my goodness, how time flies. And then the pandemic happened, which turned out to be a great thing because we were running around catching swarms, which I'll talk about in a moment. And we grew and we grew and we grew and we kept growing and we kept growing. We currently have about 25 hives between the ones at the embassy and the ones on Sean's garage roof. If you walk down 29th between Cathedral and Woodley, you'll see those hives. And I think many of you, I wish I could ask y'all to raise hands because I think many of you have probably seen them. Probably stopped by to ask questions and hopefully bought honey last October. Just a real quick word about bees. I think many of you know that there are queen bees, 1 per box, basically. There's a queen per box, per colony. Here we have a marked queen. That blue dot indicates the year. There's an international system for indicating how old a queen is because you want younger queens. They're better at keeping the hives together. They have better reproductive capacity. Their pheromones are stronger, so again, they keep that hive together. And within the colony, you have workers, which are the female bees, and you have drones, which are the male bees. Drones mostly exist to pass along genetics. Workers do everything else. So from the moment they're born, and what I have in this picture here is bees in the larval stage. And if you look over here, this kind of capped stage, they're what I call the brood stage. When they emerge, they will be bees as we recognize bees to be. And as they emerge, they immediately become nurse bees. And throughout their lifetimes, they take on a number of different roles that support the hive. A queen bee is a special thing to see. This is hive marker. Put her in this tube with this kind of grid over it. I just gently squeeze her up, put a little dot of paint on her back. You can see for size, there's a worker in there with her. Queens are about twice as long as those workers. And around the height of summer, you probably have 40,000 or so bees per colony. I want to say a word or two about the swarm squad because this is imminent. We are about, as soon as spring finally breaks, to get into swarm season, which is when about 60% of the hive basically up and leaves and goes to look in an apartment, basically. They're apartment hunting. So you might be finding clusters of bees in all sorts of locations. Up in trees, on top of roofs next to trees, on fences. You might find them on the back of your Prius. They'll go anywhere. And what they're doing here is just hanging out, waiting for scout bees to come back and tell them, hey guys, I found the apartment. Come follow me. And whoever is most convincing is basically who the rest of all those bees follows. And then they go set up house in a new location. This is bee reproduction. What I showed in the last screen is also bee reproduction. This is really how a colony reproduces and creates new colonies. Bees are eusocial creatures, so they're working together as a superorganism, essentially. If you do see a swarm, please make note of this number, save it in your phone. This is the swarm squad number. Everybody who's interested and part of the DC Beekeepers Alliance participates in the spring. We're all on like, what's up all the time, ready for word that a swarm has been spotted. And then very democratically, we each get to kind of claim a swarm. And that's how a lot of keepers build up their colonies. That's actually how curious and get all of our bees is either through swarms. So we're rescuing them from not very great locations up in trees, or we're cutting them out of people's walls. This is what happens when a swarm doesn't find a home that we would like it to find. It finds your home, a space in between your wall, or a space up in the corner of your porch. They go in and will make natural colonies in as much as they're building them in your house, which might not be where you want them to do that. So Sean and I will come cut them out. We put the comb into the hive. We put them in those hive frame with rubber bands. And as long as we catch the queen, everybody goes marching in, which is really cool. That's what I call the queen magic. Those queens produce a pheromone that really does keep that colony together. Here I've caught a swarm, I've caught the queen, and I know because all of a sudden the bees line up like magnetic filings and they start marching in. It's super cool. If you ever see a beekeeper out catching a swarm, stand and watch. It's a really neat thing to see. And then we bring them back. We put some kind of bushes in front of the hive to confuse them a little bit, tell them this is your new home. Whenever bees come into a new location, they start doing figure-8 orientation flights. So this kind of forces them to do those figure-8 orientation flights and not go back to where they think home is. This forces them to make a new home. Quick word about the riches of the hive. I know many people were at our honey sale in October. Thank you very much. That was wonderful neighborhood turnout. Bees, we have these frames put into a box, and bees will build out their brood, all those young on one part of that box, usually lower down. And then throughout the season, they're starting to build out their resources. And beekeepers like to keep nice, healthy colonies because then they produce hopefully more resources than they actually need, and we can take those resources and put them on our toast in the morning. So what you're looking at here is this waxed over part is honey. Bees are bringing back nectar. That nectar has a high water content. Bees will spend a lot of time basically dehydrating that nectar, and once it reaches 18% or less water content, they put a wax cap over it, and that will preserve forever and ever. And that's what we call honey. The wet kind of stuff that you can see in here is that nectar, and the different colored orange, yellow stuff. Sometimes we get red, sometimes we get green. That's pollen that the bees are bringing back from different sources. If you take hopefully 2 things away from this talk, don't forget the swarm squad number. Another really cool and humbling fact is that it takes the lifetimes of 12 worker bees to make 1 teaspoon of honey. So buy local and pay for your honey because these bees are working their butts off and the beekeepers are too, to make sure they stay healthy. And I'll talk about that in a moment as well. This is Sean here holding up a perfect frame of honey. This is what we want to see. This is pretty darn heavy. A box, which is for us 10 frames of honey like this, can weigh upwards of 40, 50, if we've got a really good year, perhaps 60 pounds. There's a lot of work put into this, and it is phenomenal how fast bees can put on nectar in a good season. Quick glimpse of what happens as we extract that honey. You can see me here uncapping this wax on top of the frame. We put them then vertically into the centrifuge and basically spin that honey off. And that comes dripping out here. We strain that a couple times, and if you were at the honey sale in October, that's what you bought. This was after we bottled it. Don't worry. It's really good honey. We actually won the DC Beekeepers blind honey tasting competition this year. So we're super excited and not even sort of humble about it. Couple of words about bee challenges. If you're like, oh my God, this sounds so cool, I want to be a beekeeper, I'd say slow down, take a course. Beekeeping is super challenging, especially in the city. Many of you have probably heard about colony collapse disorder. It's still not really known what that was about. It was probably due to many things. First of all, we have so many pests, so many pests. We have small hive beetles, we have varroa mites, which are basically the equivalent for us of a dinner plate sized tick. Those varroa mites transmit upwards of 30 viruses that we are aware of. Many more that we're not aware of. Larger predators out here in the Front Royal area. I am very concerned about bears. In DC, there's more human bears that do, unfortunately, regularly knock over and destroy hives. Pesticides are a big problem, and I will talk more about that later. If you're having your lawn sprayed, if you're having Mosquito Joe come around, you are not helping the bees. Climate change is affecting the seasonality of when trees bloom, or when flowers, trees being the main pollen and nectar source. That's having an impact on bees. Food scarcity, robbing, cultivars, and other empty plants. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of our native plants because we're planting a lot of usually Asian plants or cultivars, which don't have the pollen and nectar that bees need. Tomorrow we'll talk more about that. There's a lot of challenges to beekeeping. So if you are excited, I'd say slow down, take a course. It is awesome. Highly recommend it. We're always looking for help, but be aware bees are facing major challenges. And that's actually also where you can come in. A quick word, honeybees are not native to the United States, but they are essential. They were introduced in 1622. They are responsible for a vast proportion of the pollination that happens with economic crops, almonds, 100% dependent on beekeepers that take their beehives all over the nation. If you've never heard of this, look it up. It is a phenomenal thing. Avocados need honeybees. Apples, not going to happen without honeybees. Peaches, blueberries, strawberries, all of it, not going to happen without honeybees. Some fun statistics: in a single year, one honeybee colony can gather about 40 pounds of pollen. Think about that, pollen, that little stuff you barely see, and 265 pounds of nectar. Those bees are working so hard. And honeybees alone increase our nation's crop values each year by more than $15 billion. And I'll say honeybees are well studied. What is not well studied are native bees, and they are essential, period. There are more than 4,000 species in the US, more than 400 in our area. They're extremely efficient pollinators. As far as we know, they're responsible for $9 billion of economic benefit. We don't really know a whole lot about these bees, unfortunately, and they're incredibly diverse, incredibly beautiful. They're mostly vegetarian. They're highly unlikely to sting. Most of them are solitary. Honeybees are very unique in that they form such large colonies. 70% are ground nesters, about 30% are cavity nesters. You can kind of see them making their little egg colonies, or colony would be too big of a word for this, but they're reproducing in the stems, which is why you'll hear a lot of people say, leave the leaves, leave the stems. This is where native bees reproduce, and they absolutely need that material to be left or they will go extinct. Bare ground, leave them a little patch of bare ground. It makes a big deal. Leave them dead wood, leave them hollow stems. Wait till temperatures really get into springtime before you start cutting those back, because there are a lot of things using them. Fireflies especially really depend on that. Not bees, but a very popular creature that also benefits from these practices. Honeybees versus native bees. There is some debate that honeybees might be a problem for native bees. Probably not. I'm not going to weigh in here. I will say that the jury is still out. What will help regardless is if you plant native pollinator plants. Leave bare patches of dirt, plant native pollinator plants. Don't use pesticides. Plant native plants. Have a water source. Not one mosquitoes are going to be laying eggs in. Mosquito dunks are okay. Plant native pollinator plants, in case you're not getting the message, and leave stems and leaves in the fall through early spring. They make a huge difference, and tomorrow we'll give you a lot of good ideas about what might fit your yard. Big trees are basically the equivalent of 1 acre of wildflowers. So if you have a big tree that flowers, it's really important. Many of you live in DC, so you don't have that option. There's other wonderful plants that you can plant that are native. I also want to give a quick shout out to one of Tamara's colleagues. Alder Tree Gardens is run by my friend Lisa Caprilio. She was responsible for turning what's basically a golf course into a very native plant and pollinator, bird-friendly oriented habitat. You can see here, a meadow is starting to come up. We have bee beaches in this little pond. Within a week of that pond being installed, there were toads singing in it, and there's not been anything on this property for decades. So just quick shout out to Alder Tree Gardens. Definitely recommend finding a native landscaper like Lisa, like Tamara. And then you start to get really pretty flowers that attract, for example, monarch butterflies with this milkweed. Lots of benefits to going native. Again, get your green on, plant native. It's beautiful. I just stole this picture from the internet. There's so much you can do with native plants that we've just forgotten. Couple words here, go native and go big, mix annuals and perennials, herbs and shrubs and trees, early bloomers and late bloomers, mix your colors, have fun with this. Learn what's native in your area. If you just type native plants, Mid-Atlantic, native plants, Northern Virginia, DC, you're gonna find a lot. www.nwf.org, Native Plant Finder is also a great source. We're very fortunate to have a number of local native plant nurseries. I've listed a couple here. If you go to choosenatives.org, you'll find some others. If you haven't already, I highly recommend reading Doug Tallamy's Bringing Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope. He gives some great advice on what you can do, even with just a little window garden. And really provides some really cool information about what happens when you start going native and all the organisms that benefit. Again, consult with a native landscape designer. Look for a Chesapeake Bay landscape professional certification. For example, you already have 2 great recommendations from this evening. Find people who really know this stuff and can build you these beautiful blooms of flowers if you're not feeling so inclined yourself. Again, skip the pesticides and encourage your neighbors to do the same. Get rid of those standing water sources. Those are your biggest problems for mosquitoes. Do not gas everything in the neighborhood, please. Please, please, please. I speak for my bees here. It kills them. If it kills insects, it kills mosquitoes, you're killing bees and any other insect. Mosquito dunks do work. Highly recommend them if you do have a body of water that might attract mosquitoes. And again, become a native beekeeper or become a honeybee keeper. Learn more about bees, especially native bees. If you go to xerces.org, they have incredible information about everybody in the pollinator realm. Start a bee hotel or 3. That's what you see up here. Leave the leaves, leave stems, celebrate no mow May. Again, this is not just about honeybees. It's not just about native bees. It's about fireflies and butterflies and all those other lovely organisms. And again, encourage your neighbors to do the same. And if you do want to become a honeybee keeper, please reach out to DC Beekeepers Association. We offer courses, we offer a lot of support and mentoring. An incredible amount of information passes through this network via Facebook. It's a wonderful community. And learn. Beekeeping, especially in the city, because we're all close together, bees and people, is hard. It takes a lot of work. It's not just buy some bees and let them do their thing. Unfortunately, it used to be that way, but it's not anymore. And if you don't want to work that hard, become a native beekeeper by planting lots of natives and creating native habitats, or creating the habitats that native bees need to thrive. And with that, thank you very much and stay being curious. And with that, I will pass to Tamara.
Hello, can we all see that? So I'm going to take off where Aaron kind of left us, and I want to take a few steps back and talk about climate and how climate change is affecting nature, kind of generally in the United States, but more specifically in Washington, D.C., and what we can do in our gardens to help have more adaptability and deal with the changes that are happening and that will continue to happen. Just in very broad terms, in DC, we will see increased rainfall year round, and we will have summers that start earlier, last longer, and that are hotter. And I want to talk about what this means for local gardens. So I have been working at the Treguarren Conservancy designing gardens for over the past 15 years. And what's wonderful about that is that we actually have the landscape plans from 1915 on the original landscape plan with the plant palette of what was designated for those gardens at that time. And now when we work on the garden, we see what species are not working now, and we're coming up with more adaptable plants that will work now and hopefully will work in the future. So we'll talk about that. And then I will talk about how you can make your garden more adaptable for these changes in the future. So briefly, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I got this data from a DC government study that was conducted in 2015, and it's District of Columbia's plan to adapt to a changing climate. You can find this complete report online. It's fascinating, and it also has links to some of the working papers that contributed to this data. So in general, for our purposes, what we need to know is that we're going to have more frequent and intense rain events. And I know that most of you have experienced these downpours that last 5 to 10 minutes and probably rain 1 to 2 inches. And you see, gullies, and you see just rain gushing down the streets. That's going to actually happen more frequently in the future. We have much warmer average temperatures, and we will have probably 2 to 3 more times dangerously hot days. We'll have longer, hotter, and more frequent heat waves, and there will be higher tides as a result of rising sea levels. The scientists haven't been able to model this quite accurately in DC, but we know it's supposed to come because when it gets hotter, the atmosphere absorbs more water. So the National Climate Assessment also corroborates that we will have increased precipitation in the United States. Most of this precipitation we will see in the Northeast, and we'll have larger downpours. Here's map that I stole from a New York Times climate reporter. Her name is Nadja Popovich, and she does fantastic work on climate change in the United States. And what you need to see here in this map is that anything with dark green or to dark black means that it's had more average annual precipitation over the past 30 years. So you can see on the map, Northeast, we are getting wet. And if you have sea projections in the future, you'll see it gets wetter. I was unable to get her data on that, but she wrote about it in one of her articles. And here again, here's another, just a brief look at the heat emergency days in DC. This was based on the DC report that I referenced earlier. We see the baseline in 2010 was only 11 days of heat emergency, 2020s, 18 to 20 days. Projections for 2050s is 30 to 45 heat days. And in the 2080s, 40 to 75. So just looking at these two bits at this data, you see that we need to get plants who can cope with the heat and the humidity, and also with increased rainfall. So we already have seen that there has been significant shifts in plant survivability, and a lot of the plants that used to do great in DC no longer do well, and you see them wilting and suffering under the heat of the summer. There's also more need for drought-tolerant plants and better drainage. So often you have a garden that's been looking great, but with one of these downpours, they're getting gullies, they're getting really soaking wet, and they can't handle it. So one way you can do that is either plant plants that can absorb water better, or design gardens where you have dry riverbeds, or you have ways to redirect the water so the plants aren't swimming in the water. And these dramatic changes in heat and rain also result in increased pestilence. Because we have summers that start earlier and last longer, there's a lot more time for insects to reproduce, to nest. And so a lot of the decline in our plants and our trees are due to a lot of this pestilence. Most of you have seen that a lot of our glorious hardwood trees, like the oaks, we're losing a lot of those. We're losing the ash trees to emerald ash borer. We're using dogwoods to anthracnose, which is a fungal-borne pest. And all of these things are happening because of these changes in climate. Again, I see this a lot in my work at the Tree Garden, because I have the privilege of being able to compare the plants from 1915 to our new plant palette that we're devising now. So here is an actual map, or design of the Tree Garden. This is the pond area, and this is Ellen Biddle-Shipman's original design that she did in 1915. And I'm not going to ask you to look at what's on here, but I just want to show you that we deal with all of the historical data before we do the designs. And we make sure that we imitate the plants that her vision for the place, for the site. And we try to make sure the plants that we choose have similar bloom times, similar textures, and have the same kind of feel that she wanted. So here's a photo of the pond. This is a recent date photo, but we do have access to some of the photos from the 1915 and 1920s. And what we see in those photos was this: she wanted low growing understory plants that flowered with seasonal perennials and some evergreens lining the pond. And I'm showing you the slide, little shout out for the Tree Garden. I want to thank all of our donors, all of our gardeners, all of our zone gardeners that have made this possible. And we want to keep this pond looking like this in perpetuity. So hopefully when your children and grandchildren come visit, they'll still be able to see the same pond that we're seeing now. And here are some examples of replacement plants that we are doing at the Tree Garden. So Ellen Biddle-Shipman had a lot of ground ivy and vinca planted, and we're trying to move away from that because we want more natives for a lot of the reasons that Erin said. And also native plants tend to be more adaptable, and they provide cover and for bees, small pollinators, birds, or food source for small mammals. So for our substitutes for the ground ivy, the vinca, we have, and this is from left to right on the screen. The first one is Heuchera americana, Chrysogena virginiana, Hypericum, Aster divaricatus, Tiarella cordifolia. And I'm saying all these names in Latin because if you want to find these plants or purchase them at a nursery, I urge you to go with the Latin names. If you use the common names, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get. So if you like any of these plants, please go with the Latin name written down. Ellen Biddle Shipman also planted a lot of azaleas and rhododendrons, and we would love to, substitute. We love to plant more, but they're just not doing well. We do have beautiful rhododendrons that look amazing, and they look amazing because they've been planted there since 1915. They have great shade cover, and over time they've been able to have more, they've been able to adapt to the site. But when we plant them now, they simply die off. They no longer can do that. So what we're trying to do to substitute them is that there is one rhododendron, the PJM rhododendron, that seems to be doing okay. We're crossing our fingers on that. Calacanthus is a great substitute. There's a great variety of viburnums. There's a lot of natives, and they are wonderful. They have beautiful scents in the spring. They're a great addition to the trigarin and other shrubs such as winterberry. That's the shrub in the bottom right corner with the red berries. So then Ellen Biddle Shipman's replacement plants for trees. She planted a lot of beeches and oaks, which are gorgeous, and they're some of the largest trees on site, but we are losing them in storms and also to disease. So we're trying to replace some of them in kind with the same species, but we're also diversifying to also offer the trigarin more adaptability. So we are adding yellowwoods, katsura trees. There's a beautiful katsura down by the pond, sycamore, and a wider variety of maples and oaks. And for the pond area, she had water lilies. We still have water lilies, but we're also adding other shade tolerant aquatic plants such as blue button and blue flag iris. So just to kind of recap, in order to adapt more to this climate change, which for DC means more rain, increased overall precipitation, and intense heavy storms. So what we do need to do in DC in general is have better drainage. So the DC government is trying to have less impervious surfaces, and it's really has doubled down on its efforts to allow precipitation to drain closer to where it fell. So what DCRA wants you to do when you do any kind of changes on your property, they want to make sure that whatever precipitation falls on your property, that it drains in the property. They don't want you to divert it outwards because there's just too much pressure on the stormwater system. So in order to achieve better drainage in your gardens, you can do various things. You can install a rain garden, you can install underground dry wells, or you can install dry riverbeds, and you can also plant more plants that absorb water and like being in water. So on a very general level, the green infrastructure that you may see in DC are these dry riverbeds. In the photo here, you see a dry riverbed that it's beautiful that they did outside of the Department of Energy and Environment. There is, but you can see these happening all throughout the city. For instance, there's a great dry riverbed that they did on 32nd Street and Klingle Road. And it's been, I think they installed it 3 years ago, and they're trying to do more and more of these around the city. So this is for the homeowners thinking about what kind of tree to plant now, given all these circumstances. And we want to make sure that when you plant a tree, which takes 40 to 60 to 80 years to mature, that you plant a tree that can deal with these new climate situations 40 to 60, 80 years down the road. So I'm just listing a few of my favorites. The list is much longer. If you need to have more information on this, I'm happy to help. But just for this presentation, I've just listed a few that I think are robust and will really do well. So the first one on the top is an amelanchier. It's a serviceberry. It's a beautiful native shrub. It's considered either a large shrub or a small to medium tree. They're deciduous. They have beautiful red berries in the spring that can be eaten by humans. And if you get there in time before the birds, you can actually make marmalade from them. They're fantastic. The Magnolia virginiana, or sweet bay magnolia. These are found in the wild along stream banks, so they do love being wet. It's a beautiful magnolia. It's a lighter magnolia than the southern magnolia, which is what you may be used to. So for a residential property, it really works well. It's considered semi-evergreen. Sometimes in our more mild winters, it will retain some of their leaves. This winter, I think they're losing most of their leaves because it's been so cold, but they can retain their leaves in that winter, so that's another plus. The Quercus bicolor, which is the swamp white oak, which, as you can tell by its common names, it loves being wet in swamps. Acer rubrum, the red maple, Nyssa selvatica, black gum, Betula nigra, which is the river birch. River birches tended to not like the heat, and there are now new cultivars that are good for our zones. I would highlight that it's called Dura Heat or Heritage, are two great cultivars that have been doing well in DC. And the Taxodium distichum, which is the bald cypress, which loves wet. You see a lot of those down south, but they also do well here. And here's some green trees for the 21st century that are great for wet sites that are evergreen. So the Chamaecyparis species in general is great. Other magnolia that is evergreen is the Magnolia grandiflora. Again, magnolias tend to love water. Pinus taida, the loblolly pine, which you see a lot along the eastern seaboard, and the thuyas. And here is a depiction of a rain garden. So this is what a rain garden would look like in your property. Now, obviously, the location of the rain garden should be where the water is flowing. Here in this illustration, we have it flowing. It's located 10 feet away from the house's foundation. And underneath, you have a subgrade where you add soil that is good for rain gardens. And I usually put another layer of aggregate of stone to facilitate better drainage. And then I plant it with plants that I will tell you in the next slides. Obviously, this is just an illustration. You have to kind of do a site analysis to know where is the best place for your rain garden. Sometimes I plant rain gardens along the perimeter of a property, because if the grade of the neighboring property is higher, then it's good that when the water starts flowing from neighbor's house into your garden, you can have a rain garden there that will capture the water. It's also a beautiful feature of your garden. So you also kind of want to try to integrate it with other parts of your garden to make it all work. So here are some photos of rain gardens. Some I have done, some I just got off the internet, but you can see how they're beautiful. And I always try to populate mine with native species that are colorful, and it's a great addition to your garden. And you can actually do it in most places if you have these, wherever your rainwater is draining. So some ideas for shrubs that you can put either in your rain garden or just on wet sites. If you have a soggy area of your garden, these will do great and they'll be very happy. Ilex glabra is on the top. Inkberry, Ilex verticillata is on the left. It's winterberry, and there you see it's on all its glory with the red berries in the wintertime. The only tip there is that when you plant the Ilex verticillata, the general rule is that you need, for every 5 female plants, you need a male plant to pollinate the females. Then you have Clethra alnifolia, which is the plant with the white blooms in the middle. That is a gorgeous plant. It blooms in the summertime, delicious scents. We have a lot of those around the pond at the Tregaron. And you can either have white blooms or pink blooms, and you can either have miniature size or taller ones. That has a lot of great cultivars. We have Viburnum trilobum, which is another great one. It's bottom right. That tends to be a larger viburnum, and it has beautiful blooms in the springtime that smell fantastic. And the last one on the list I have is the Cornus sericea, which is the red twig dogwood. In the photo, it has leaves on it, but when the leaves, in the wintertime, when it loses its leaves, it has these gorgeous red stems, and they look fantastic, for instance, in front of a greenhouse, or if they're in front of an evergreen screen, they really shine in the wintertime, and after snow, they're just fantastic. So again, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some things that I love using, but there are a lot more other shrubs that you could use if you want to get more adventurous. And then here is my short list again for perennials. The top one is Hemerocallis, daylilies. I used to be a personal naysayer of the daylily. I thought it was like used too much. Why am I always finding this thing? I'm just sick of this plant. But the fact of the matter is, the reason why you see them everywhere is because they survive. They're survivors. So if you just want to plant something and not have to worry about it, I highly recommend the daylily, and they come in a lot of different color blooms. So this would be a great one for you. Another one is the Echinacea purpurea, purple coneflower. We have Monarda, which is bee balm, and then we have two ferns at the bottom, Osmanda regalis and Osmanda cinnamomea. So the deal here is that they all love wet, but they have different requirements for shade and light. So you may want to look further into that before you plant them. Oh, and then I just got the 5-minute warning, but I guess I finished up. So thank you very much. I'll let us open this up for Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Tamara and Aaron. Appreciate that. And we have some great questions tonight. And I'm going to start those with Aaron. But while I'm doing that, if there are other questions, please put it in the chat and we'll get a chance to answer them. So Aaron, everyone wants to know, when's the honey sale?
We won't know until we know how the nectar flow season is this year. Nectar flow runs pretty much until early to mid-June, and then things dry up. We move into robbing season, but that's also when we start taking that honey. Probably it'll be a bit earlier this year than October, but stay posted. Cleveland Park listserv, we'll let you know.
Great, thanks so much. The other question, Aaron, that we received during your presentation was, is hive collapse still a problem? You mentioned that it had been, but is it still currently a problem? And can you say more about that?
I think it's still very much under investigation. We know that there's a general decline in honeybees if it weren't for the fact that so many people are getting into honeybee keeping. So because there are kind of more stewards of bees and we're encouraging bee colonies, you're not seeing as strong of a decline as you might otherwise see. Again, there's a lot of things driving the collapse or the decline of bees, of any bees, of all pollinators, really. So it's definitely still a problem. And as far as anybody really has been able to show, it's a mix of pesticides and overdevelopment and climate change and the innumerable pests that have gained a foothold here.
Great, thanks. And also, Aaron, can you say a little bit more about what part does the collection of pollen play in making honey?
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent question. Pollen is basically protein for the bees, and the bees make bee bread from that and a little bit of honey, and that's what they feed their young. So that's an important part of their nutrition.
Great, thank you. Let me go to Tamara next, and we'll come back to you, Aaron. Tamara, you mentioned some recommendations for some basic DC gardens. We were wondering if you have some more, and if there are any particular nurseries that folks can go to find those plants that you might recommend.
So in terms of nurseries, you know, we have less nurseries than we used to. I like American Plant Food. There's one, they're both on River Road. One is kind of by that Whole Foods on River Road, and then one is on River Road, almost near the Beltway. And they're very helpful, and they have a wide variety of plants. Or else you can go out to Merrifield in Virginia.
Great. And any other recommendations that you would have for a basic DC garden where the plants will, you know, appreciate a wet environment?
Where can you, I don't know if I understand that question.
Where the plants would do well with a wet environment.
So where I would do that garden?
No, what are the plants that you would recommend?
Well, some of the ones that I did in the slides, and with all those plants, some of those plants are better in, like, for instance, Ilex verticillata is really good with very wet, soggy conditions, where some of the plants are just good at filtering water and aren't necessarily going to do great if they're, you know, if their roots are soggy for an extended period of time. Online, there's great resources on like what plants tolerate wet, soggy sites versus what plants tolerate wet sites. And they're very good at like delineating which ones can deal with which kinds of conditions.
Great, thanks. And someone just put in the chat that Chesapeake natives is a wonderful organization in PG County as well as
Yeah.
Pawtucket Nursery. But they want to know also, Tamara, if the wonderful bullfrog, king of the Tregaron Pond, ever found a soulmate.
Ever what?
Found a soulmate.
Well, they look for soulmates every year around April or May. I think you probably, if you've lived in the neighborhood, you hear them. And that the time that they're looking for soulmates depends on how late or early our spring is.
Okay, great. So back to, actually, I'll stay with you, Tamara. How do apartment?
Can I just do one more comment on that pond, just
Sure.
in terms of planting things? So we've been working on the past 15 years on rehabilitating the pond, and we've added more native species, lily pads. There's now more shade that goes over the pond. And all these things have contributed to the return of the bullfrogs because now they have a place to nest, they have a place to eat. And so all these changes in our local ecology have really contributed to these things happening. There weren't bullfrogs there 20 years ago for a reason. It was in a state of neglect, and there were a lot of invasives, and there weren't plants planted there that were going to be successful to promote local wildlife.
Great, thanks. So we have another question from Sarah. How do apartment complexes, especially those owned by larger companies, play a role in drainage?
Okay, so that's a great question. So any place where you can encourage a pervious surface, like any paved surface, if you can encourage your building to take out the paving and to plant a garden there, all that's going to help, because what's happening is that there's too much of the city that's getting paved over, and that's why the water just keeps on flowing. So a lot of these complexes may not want to rip off concrete that they have, but if you have a very, persuasive reason why it's important and all the ecological benefits it will contribute, maybe, that would be the way to go.
And is there, as a follow-up, Tamara, is there a way to find out on those properties where it might be suitable for removal of the concrete and good places for a more green infrastructure?
Sure. So my first idea is you go out when it's raining and you see where all the rain is falling and where it's all, flowing to. If you don't want to do that, you can walk the property on a non-raining day and see kind of where the changes in grade are. And you probably want to go to a place that's a lower grade where you can say, okay, this area, this is a good, candidate for a rain garden.
Great. Thanks so much, Tamara. Let me now go back to Erin. And people want to know how they can assist with the Swiss Embassy Bee Project. Do they have a volunteer corps? And if so, what's the process for becoming a volunteer?
Really, it's to reach out to me. We are always looking for volunteers, but we really want people who are really dedicated to learning beekeeping. I've probably said it a few times, beekeeping is not just something you kind of do. You really have to be kind of focused on learning how to do it, become accustomed to the schedule of the bees and the sort of work that needs to be done throughout the year. That said, if you don't want to get into the hives, the best thing you can do to help is do exactly what Tamara's been suggesting, and I might have said a few times, is plant native. Any space that you have, even if it's just a windowsill, can make a big difference. Pull up those pavements. All of that helps bees. It helps all the other pollinators as well. So you do a big, big part in helping the bees just by maintaining your own gardens for a number of different species with native habitats and plants.
Great. Thanks so much. And while we're waiting for a few more questions here, I'd like to just say that we will make the presentations available as well as a recording of this. Those will be available on our website, which is www.tuesdaytalksdc.com. I'll put that in the chat as well. But you can always go there and see all of our Tuesday talks, the ones that we've had since the pandemic that have been online. But we will also make sure to put up some links to their sites or their presentation so that people can access the information that was included in the slides. So I'm going to ask people to also look at the chat, because there's some great places that have been recommended where you can also get more information on native plants, such as Environmental Concern, and St. Michael's has native plants as well as others. So I'm going to ask now for any last questions before we wrap up, or any last statements that Tamara or Aaron want to make.
Quickly, can I just add on to the native plant thing? Before the pandemic, the National Arboretum had a great native plant sale in the spring and in the fall. I don't know if they stopped doing that because of the pandemic, but they had a fantastic variety of native plants, and it's really fun to go see because they have a lot of varieties that you can't find in nurseries. So it's a great resource. I just don't know if they're recommencing this or not. Maybe Aaron knows.
I don't know. I will, since I'm unmuted, quickly jump in and address the question of, does the source of pollen affect the taste of the honey? Yes. But I will say, for those of you buying honey in the city, the bees are generalists. A lot of bees are specialists, which means they need specific native plants, many of which Tamara mentioned. But honeybees will go anywhere. They can manage pretty much any sort of plant that produces the pollen and nectar that they're looking for. If you were to have a colony in the middle of, say, nothing but black locusts, you would have a very distinctive tasting honey. And that's what happens when you're buying avocado honey or mesquite honey. Bees will travel for up to 3 miles. And that's kind of on average. They have been recorded to go much, much further. So in DC, your bees are getting a little bit of everything. You're getting a taste of DC when you have DC honey.
And one last question, Aaron, is there a way to, since you won the tasting competition, how do you change the flavor, or is it just sort of luck based upon where your bees are located?
It depends on where your bees are located. If we wanted to really have a special flavored honey, we would have to find a place where we could put our hives where the bees would pretty much only be sourcing their food from that particular plant. So like a mesquite, you're going to need a lot of mesquite to really get mesquite honey. Again, they can travel for up to 3 miles on average. They've been recorded to go as far as 30 to 100 miles. So a hungry bee will travel.
And we have another question for you, Tamara. Is the big stump just west of the Klingel entrance to the Tregaron Conservancy the stump of one of the original Twin Oaks, after which Twin Oaks was named?
Yes, that is it. And we are trying to find a replacement. We won't remove the stump because it's important for local species, as we've been saying before, but we're looking for another twin oak that we can plant, which means you can find an oak tree that actually has twin central leaders.
And does Tregaron also have a volunteer corps? And if so, how might one become familiar with that?
Yeah, so we absolutely have a Tregaron corps, and they do fantastic work for us. You can go on the website and sign up. We have different kinds of volunteers. We have gardeners that just help us with everyday tasks. We also have people who are zone gardeners, and they're in charge of specific gardens in the Tregaron, and we brief them in terms of like what we want it to look like or what they should be doing. So we really have a lot of great volunteers, and we'd love to have more.
Great. And we have a question about how to sign up for the Cleveland Park listserv. I would recommend that if you just, it's a Google group. So if you Google, sounds ironic, but Google adding Google group, you should be able to find that. If not, you feel free to give us a call at the Village, and I'll be happy to help you with that. Any one final question, Tamara, does Tregaron work with Twin Oaks? They have a lot of land and could use some native plant love. Do you know?
We have a cordial relationship with Twin Oaks. But they take care of their own gardens. That's where we are right now. But it used to be one estate, as most of you know about the history of the Treguarren. The estate used to extend from the beginning of Twin Oaks all the way down to where it is right now. It used to be one piece of land.
Great. Thank you, Tamara, and thank you, Erin. I'll turn it over to Linda now.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, especially Tamara and Erin. Guys, you have just given us so much useful information tonight. We know what we need to go out there and do, and also what we need not to do. We're indebted to you both. Thanks to our audience, as always, for joining us. And a special thanks tonight, too, to Frank Finnemore, who not only moderated the Q&A, but also ran the technology behind the scenes. That's quite a feat. We hope you'll be back with us on March 15th, when we have multi-talented Woodley Park residents Barry Byrne and Scott Cedar talk about their lifetime in the arts. Until then, please stay warm and be well. Good night and thank you.